Welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. We also host Madlik Disruptive Torah on Clubhouse every Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern, and this week, along with Rabbi Mintz, we discuss the Torah portion that includes the 10 Commandments, but is named after a non-Jewish priest named Jethro. For a religion that is known for exclusivism, we use Jethro's contribution and top billing to explore inclusivism, universalism, and pluralism in Jewish tradition. So come listen to a story about a man named Jethro as we ponder the question, is Judaism exclusive or inclusive? Well, welcome to Madlik, another week of Madlik Disruptive Torah. And this week, wow, do we have a great portion, a great parsha. It is the portion that includes, as I said in the intro, the 10 Commandments. But it's named after Moses' father-in-law, who was a priest of Midian named Jethro. So we're going to focus right on the beginning of the parsha, something that we don't normally do, and I'm just going to dive into it, and as we do, we'll explore some fascinating insights. So in Exodus 18:1, it says, Jethro, priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard all that God had done for Moses and for Israel his people, how the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. And then it goes on to say, he sent word to Moses, your father-in-law Jethro are coming to you with your wife and her 2 sons. Moses went out to meet his father-in-law. He bowed low and kissed him. Each asked after the other's welfare, and they went into the tent. Moses then recounted to his father-in-law everything that the Lord had done to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians for Israel's sake, all the hardships that had befallen them on the way, and how the Lord had delivered them. And Jethro rejoiced over all the kindness that the Lord had shown Israel when he delivered them from the Egyptians. And he did something very Jewish. He made a blessing. Blessed be the Lord, Jethro said, who delivered you from the Egyptians and from Pharaoh, and who delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods, yes, by the result of their very schemes against the people. And Jethro's father-in-law brought a burnt offering and sacrifices for gods. So in the Hebrew it says, he brought olah uzvachim le'elokim. And Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to partake of the meal before God with Moses' father-in-law. Next day, Moses sat at the magistrate among the people, while the people stood about Moses from morning until evening. But when Moses' father-in-law saw how much he had to do for the people, he said, now he does something that's really Jewish. He starts giving advice. What is this thing that you are doing to the people? Why do you act alone while all the people stand about you from morning until evening? Moses replied to his father-in-law, it's because the people come to me to inquire of God. When they have a dispute, it comes before me, and I decide before one person and another, and I make known the laws and teaching of God. But Moses' father-in-law said to him, the thing you are doing is not right. You will surely wear yourself out, and these people as well, for the task is too heavy for you. You cannot do it alone. Now listen to me, and I will give you counsel, and God be with you. And he basically set up the laws of jurisprudence that until today are followed in Judaism, of Bet Din and a Sanhedrin, of setting up how do you resolve the law and how do you define the law. And he said at the end, if you do this, and God so commands you, you will be able to bear up, and all these people too will go home unwearied. Moses heeded his father-in-law and did just as he had said. So here we have this priest from Midian, a non-Jew, who comes to Moses, and first of all, he gives a blessing. He gives a bracha. Then he offers sacrifices. He brings an olah and zvachim. And then he gives advice, which he says was sanctioned by God, and Moses listens to him. So this, so many times when people talk about this, they focus on the last part, that he gave this sage advice, this wisdom advice about setting up the courts. And I think they miss the fact that he makes a blessing, and I think they miss the fact that he brings a sacrifice, and the words that are used for that sacrifice are exactly the words that are used in the later Israelite tradition of bringing a sacrifice. And then, yes, he does give a legal ruling that is sanctioned by God. So, Rabbi, what do you make of this? Is this as unique and as fascinating to you as it is to me?
It is. And I'm going to just, I'm going to echo your questions, and I'm going to raise you one. And that is, last week we read about the splitting of the sea. This week we read about the giving of the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai. You would expect that the story in the middle would be something that would be tremendously uplifting. And instead, it's a story about Moses getting advice from his father-in-law. And it's not even clear that Moses does anything wrong. And he gets advice from his father-in-law. And the question is, what is this story about? And why is it placed right before the giving of the Torah? And I would just throw an idea out which will kind of begin our discussion of your questions. Maybe the story is here to teach us about what Moses is like. Maybe the real question in this week's Torah reading is, who is this Moses who deserved that the Torah, the Ten Commandments, should be given to him? What has he done? He did he followed God, he went to Pharaoh, but who is he? And you know what we learn about him? We learn about him that his father-in-law is upset because he sits and he listens to the people from the morning until the evening. That's pretty amazing when you think about it. That was his cry, that he was totally committed to the people from the morning to the evening. Maybe the story is not a story about Jethro. Maybe the story is a story about Moshe, to tell us that, you know what? He is the right person to receive the Torah, the Ten Commandments, because he's someone who really cares about the people. He sits with the people from morning until night.
So I love that you've kind of personalized it. We all know that Moses is humble. And certainly, and there are many situations where one wonders where that attribute comes from, because we know he has an anger management issue. He gets angry very easily. But where is the humility? And I think this early on, we've already come across it in the burning bush, where he says, "Why pick me?" But I think you're absolutely right that this humility of the man and why maybe the man was chosen comes through. And it does take humility to listen to advice from other people. But I think that we can focus on the Moses, but we can also focus on the bigger picture, because as you say, why was it put here? Why was it put literally before the Torah is given? Why are we exposed to the fact that here is another religious figure who comes and gives blessings, who comes and gives sacrifices, and who comes and can speak in the name of the Lord and say, this is not what you're doing. And I do think it's fascinating also, and maybe we'll come and address this at another time. The reason that he gives is fascinating because he says it's not sustainable. He doesn't say what you're doing is wrong. He just says that it's not realistic. You'll burn yourself out. But getting back to why it features right before we get to the giving of the Torah, I think all of us know the midrashim that talks about why was the Torah actually given where it was given at Sinai. And we probably also know that the reasons that it was given, and not in the land of Israel, was because it was on neutral ground, so to speak. It was not in any particular country or nationality. And I think that has to be a little bit of what factors into this discussion. We all know the wonderful midrashim that says that God went to all the nations of the world. And that is why he gave the Torah at Sinai. In Sifrei Devarim it says, "And the Lord came from Sinai. When the Lord appeared to give Torah to Israel, it is not to Israel alone that he appeared, but to all the nations." And I think this concept or this introduction of talking to a Jethro, it kind of plays with both this idea of humility, both on a personal level of Moses, but also on a national level. It takes a level of humility to say that the truths or the revelation that you're going to be receiving not only belongs to you, but belongs to everyone. And conversely, not only comes from your wisdom, but comes from the universal wisdom of all humanity. So I'm kind of taking your point and I'm almost expanding it. I'm taking Moses as a person and Moses as a personification. Does that resonate with you at all?
I like it. I like it. So I was emphasizing Moses as a person, and you're talking about Moses as a personification. But both are important, because if we're going to appreciate why the Ten Commandments are given to Moses, and this is always interesting, they're given to Moses as a person and Moses as a personification. And Moses actually, and this is also has to do with the Jethro story, you almost get a sense that Moses is like the two train tracks at the 72nd Street subway station. You have the express and you have the local. On one hand, you have Moses as the leader of the people, the one who talks to God, the one who seems to literally be living in heaven. That's the express train. But then you have the slower train. That's Moses as a person. And, Moses doesn't necessarily do so well that way. Because Moses, he seems to be separated from his wife and children, because it says that Jethro brings his wife and children. We don't hear very much about Moses' interaction, the 40 years in the desert with his wife. So we're not sure how Moses does as a person. But here we have an insight that while he may not be so good with his own family, but he's very, very good as we might call a shul rabbi. He's someone who cares about the people from morning to night. And, that's something that's also very important. So it's Moses. So the Ten Commandments are given to Moses on the express track and given to Moses on the local track.
So, I think when we read the Torah, each one of us brings a little bit of their own personality. And I love the fact as a pulpit rabbi, you look at Moses and you deal with the most lifelong challenge of anyone who serves the community, not only in clergy, but in any facet of life. This tension between serving man as a whole and then wonder about your family and your children and your wife. And I love that there. But there is a tension here. And I think that to just jump in and say, yes, the reason why the Bible brings this little story of the pagan priest who has an effect on Moses right before the giving of the Torah is such a universalistic message and ties into this concept that the Torah was given in the desert and belongs to everybody. We could fall into the trap and say that this is such an easy thought. It's such an easy read. But I'd like to play the devil's advocate a little bit and talk about how the classical commentaries looked at this, and through that to see that to kind of give us a fact check, that we're looking at this in the right way. So the Ramban, Nachmanides, who we came across a little bit last week, brings the Midrashic interpretation, and he says that this could be in sequence. It could be that this happened before the giving of the Torah. But he says it's also possible to explain that Scripture arranged the entire narrative of Jethro, even though the particular event occurred after he stayed with the Israelites a long time, and in the meantime became converted through circumcision, immersion, and the sprinkling of the blood of a sacrifice according to Jewish law. So here Ramban, Nachmanides, is echoing what's in the Midrashim, and it's this big discussion of, number one, did Jethro ever convert? And if he did convert, when did this story happen? We all know there's a concept in biblical hermeneutics, and it says ein mukdam u'mu'achar b'Torah, that there's no time frame within the biblical narrative, that you can have flashbacks. You don't necessarily have to render the events in the chronology that they happened. You can have some sort of literary and poetic license. And there are many within the classical biblical commentators and the Midrashim who have a really hard time in accepting that Jethro, when he said these things, was not Jewish. It was very hard for them to accept that something as basic as how jurisprudence is set up could have come from a non-Jew. It's very hard for them to accept that non-Jews could give zvachim and olot, sacrifices, as we Jews do. It's hard for them to accept that a non-Jew could bless God. And I think it's important to recognize this challenge that they have, because it gives more credence to the fact that if you take the opinion, which they all cite, that this was in chronological order, how revolutionary, how radical it was. And I don't want to dilute that in terms of looking at a religious biblical text and saying matter-of-factly, yeah, they were open to suggestions and from a non-Jew, and more importantly, that they were open and understood and gave value to religious experiences outside of Judaism.
Wow, that's a lot there. First, let's talk about whether Jethro was Jewish and whether it mattered whether Jethro was Jewish. I mean, when you talk about who's Jewish, look at Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Who did they marry? They didn't marry Jews. What made them Jewish? The answer is that they married Jews, so they became Jewish. And that's probably what happened in those days. If a woman married a Jewish man, then the woman became Jewish. So see, what's interesting is that Tzipporah is Jewish, even though her father is not Jewish. That's interesting, isn't it? But Jethro, is identified throughout the Torah, whenever he's talked about, as Kohen Midyan. He's very much not Jewish. He's very much, the wise man from Midyan. I always like to read the story that it's nice that advice comes from outside. I don't really need Jethro to be Jewish. Do you need Jethro to be Jewish?
I think it's a stretch. I think that the commentators who struggle with it and who make Jethro Jewish are telling us more about themselves than they're telling us about the text.
That is such an interesting point. I mean, that's really good.
and maybe about ourselves. We are those of us who study the biblical text, and I don't care whether we're Jewish or Christian or Muslim, we all share this kind of text. We're proud of our story. And I can understand that. But I also think that it's radical from within that story. It doesn't say the ex-Cohen from Midian. It says the priest from Midian. So I think we can all agree that the simple reading of the text is that he actually was a priest from Midian at the time that this story occurred, and that they are simply illuminating to us and reminding us how radical this is. And therefore, I give their response such value because there's a truth in what they're saying. There's the expression in business, not created here. Even in a business, even in creativity, in literature, in art, we all love to claim that we're not influenced by others and that we came up with things on our own. And it takes a radical text to be able to clearly say that it is the result of the best. So I want to continue with this discussion about the sacrifices and the blessing. If you recall last week, and this is kind of almost a two-part series, we had Maimonides saying that these sacrifices were all there as kind of a concession to bring the people from one spot to another. And if you recall, Nachmanides said, no, Noah gave sacrifices. Cain and Abel gave sacrifices. They were not idol worshipers. So there was nothing wrong with using sacrifices because it was part of the original natural religion. And I think if we have to focus on what is and dive a little bit deeper into how a text like the Torah can so easily accept the contributions of a Jethro. And, I keep on saying that Jethro gave the sacrifice. Well, I should also mention that Aaron came and ate from the sacrifice. This was not anything but a holy offering to God. So those midrashim actually on our texts here, and they're all in the source notes in Sifariah, talk about how this concept that Adam and Cain and Noah actually followed a natural religion that every human being is imbued with, that has this kind of desire to make an offer of a sacrifice, if you will, that have this natural desire for prayer, that have a natural desire for blessing, and even expand further. This is kind of fascinating. One of the midrashim says, so why did Noah sacrifice after he was saved? Because when God told him to put animals onto the ark 2 by 2, when it came to kosher animals, he said, add 7. And according to the Midrash, Noah said to himself, I'm not a dummy. Why is he adding more of these pure animals? The word kosher didn't exist in those days.
Right, of course. Right.
So, but even here, there's this sense that Judaism has allegiance and is a continuation of this, what I would love to call this natural tendency, characteristic, part of humankind for religion. Those people who sometimes I listen on Clubhouse to atheistic groups, and what they all forget when they ask, is there a God? Is there not a God? I'd like to say, is there beauty? Is there love? There are things that are part of the human condition that have been there for such a long time that you can't put your finger on, but they are part of us. We have this sensibility for love. We have this sensibility for beauty, and we have this sensibility for religion. And I think the Jewish texts that talk about the origins of many of the customs of the Jews in human nature play tribute to that. And I think that's also part of what this is an exploration of. It is almost as though the Torah was given at Sinai to the Jews, but it was offered to all of humankind. It was offered in a neutral zone, and therefore it is an exploration, it's an aspiration, it's a rendering of what is very natural to humanity. And I think that's also part of the message here.
So that midrash that the Torah was offered to all the nations, does that mean that the Torah is inclusive? Or is that point of that midrash that the other nations gave up the chance, that they're no good because they didn't appreciate the value of Torah? See, I don't think that's about inclusion. There is a midrash about inclusion. The midrash about inclusion says that when God said, I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt, that the entire world was quiet, that a bird didn't chirp and a baby didn't cry. And the entire world heard God say, I am the Lord your God. That midrash is very much inclusive. That means that the entire world was part of the experience at Mount Sinai, which is a very powerful idea. Not that we left people out, but actually that everybody was part of it.
So I agree with you totally, but I want to focus on the flip side of that. It's not so much that everybody was included and open and privy and made available the revelation at Sinai going forward, but that the revelation at Sinai was an expression of something that was natural to man. And there's a critical difference there. And what I was touching upon was this sense that Jethro was in the tradition of Noah, of Adam, of Cain and Abel, of those who followed this natural kind of human condition where we believe and man reaches out that there's something more there and that we don't know quite what it is, and we express ourselves, whether we're Buddhists or whether we're Hindus or whether we're Muslims or whether we're Christians. And there is this also aspect in Judaism and in the classical texts where we all had it and we kind of lost it. A good example is the story of why we celebrate a holiday of lights. And the Talmud in Avodah Zarah talks about the exact 7 days that we celebrate Hanukkah, that is close to when the Christians celebrate Christmas and have their lights. And it says that Adam was alive during the part of time, the first year that he went through, and he saw the days were getting shorter and shorter, and he was sure the world was coming to an end. And then all of a sudden there was the winter solstice, and the days started to get longer. And he created a festival. And it's where the Talmud in Avodah Zarah is talking about pagan festivals. And it ends by saying, he, Adam, established these festivals for the sake of heaven, but they, the Gentiles of later generations, established them for the sake of idol worship. So here too, it's almost as though there's a patrimony of humanity, that we all have these needs to celebrate light when it gets dark, to talk about hope when it seems that there is no hope. And that the Judaic or the concept of revelation that we're celebrating in the parshat of Jethro is one that says not only is it available to all the nations, but it comes from a shared patrimony of all the nations. And I think that's kind of fascinating and exciting.
That is fascinating and exciting. And I think, we talk about inclusion, and that was the title of tonight's class, the idea of inclusion. And I think that maybe that's the lesson. We started, at least I started, by suggesting that the reason this story is here is to tell you about the personality of Moses. And I think we're coming full circle, and your suggestion is a little different. Your suggestion is that the reason this story is here is to tell us that Judaism, the Ten Commandments, the law, is really inclusive. And it incorporates a lot of different kinds of people and a lot of different kinds of traditions and a lot of different kinds of things. And while God may have said, I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage, which is something very Jewish, but actually before he says that, we have the story of Jethro. Before it's specific, before it's exclusive, first it's inclusive. And I think that's a great, great point. So I think that's really, a really nice read of the introductory chapter to the giving of the Torah. I want to wish everybody that they should enjoy receiving the Ten Commandments this Shabbat, and we look forward to seeing you next week when we start the civil law, Mishpatim, and all the stories related to that. Shabbat Shalom, Geoffrey. Shabbat Shalom, everybody.
Shabbat Shalom to you all. We've certainly had a wonderful introduction with the help of these parshiot to the law that we're going to get. So I look forward to sharing with you our journey as we discover those laws. I wish you all a Shabbat Shalom, and listen to the podcast. This is recorded, and there are source notes that go much farther in terms of the discussion than a half hour will permit. But Shabbat Shalom to you all, and I will see you all next week on Madlik Disruptive Torah.